Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Dr. Braxton Hunter, and today is a special day. We're going to look at the subject, the theme of the sovereignty of God in the final 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. But what this means is we have reached the end of something that I've been doing for 5 or 6 years in moving through the book of Genesis in a verse-by-verse way, commenting on the text so that we can hopefully get a better understanding, a deeper understanding of what's going on, but also supplying apologetic material. Is there an allegation of a contradiction in the text somewhere or some other Bible error? And we address that. And this has been one of the most fruitful things that I've ever done in my life in ministry. And I hope that in some way it's been beneficial to you as well, and I thank you for being here. If you didn't realize that this was a series and you'd like to see the rest of the episodes in the series, you can go to youtube.com/Braxton Hunter and click on the Genesis playlist, or you can go to trinityradio.org and click on the verse-by-verse tab to hear them as audio episodes. Why the sovereignty of God? Those of you who've been with me since the beginning will recall that in the very first episode of this series, I mentioned that one of the major themes in the book of Genesis, the dominant theme perhaps, has been always thought by believers to be God's sovereignty, God's, perhaps one would want to say God's providence, but that God is in control. And this means that if we're going to understand exactly what we're saying throughout this text, I'm going to be referring to sovereignty quite a bit and God's control quite a bit. And you may not know exactly what Christians mean when they say that God is in control. So Christians at least have 2 general positions on this. There are Christians who are determinists, and those Christians who are determinists are called Calvinists after John Calvin. And they would say that everything that happens in the history of man, including the movement of the smallest molecule, is ultimately, even through second causes, determined by God, such that it could not have been otherwise. And that goes for human choices as well. Whereas non-Calvinists like myself would say, well, no, God is certainly in control and he's certainly sovereign. But at least in most cases, mankind has the libertarian freedom to make real choices. And they could have chosen otherwise, or at least nothing outside of themselves determined what they would end up choosing. And so oftentimes Calvinists will say to non-Calvinists, you have a lower view of sovereignty than we do, because we believe that God literally controls everything in the sense of determinism. I just want to say something about that I don't think that my Calvinist brothers and sisters should have a problem with. And that is simply this. Both Calvinists and non-Calvinists who are Orthodox, at least, we both think that God is maximally sovereign. He is as sovereign as he can possibly be. And I think that that's a really big statement. Well, then how can that be if we view 2 things differently, if we both view it differently than this? Well, the reason for that is because sovereignty has to do with God's position of authority. We know what a sovereign is. A sovereign is a king, and a king is someone who has authority over his kingdom, basically, his realm. And he can step in at any time. He can do as he pleases. He can dole out rewards and punishments. And these are all things that kings do. But they're also things that the Bible tells us that God is and God does. Therefore, God is sovereign. Well, what's the difference between that king and the one true king of all kings? Well, that's because his realm in which he has authority is the entire cosmos. And in the entire cosmos, the whole of creation, he can step in at any time, dole out rewards and punishments, do as he pleases. But that leaves open the question, does it please him to control via determinism? Or is he a sovereign in as far as this goes, in the same way that other kings are sovereign? Not to minimize anything about God, but just to say words have meanings. And it means that God is in control, and if he wants to step in, he can, and all these kinds of things. But we both think that God is as sovereign as he can possibly be, both the Calvinist and myself, because sovereignty has to do with his position of authority. And but determinism or free will and how God does all those things, that has to do with what he does with that position of authority, how he exercises it. And so I thought that was important to mention right at the beginning. And if you don't care anything about the whole Calvinism debate, well, then maybe you should, but at the very least we can move on from here. But whatever you think of God's control, that God is in control, we currently need to recognize that in our world right now, we need to know that we have a God who is in control and who can step in. As I'm recording this for you, it's been all over the news the past couple of days about Afghanistan. And the U.S. has pulled out of Afghanistan, and it's gone horrifically. The power structures there are falling apart. And we saw the famous, it will be famous, I have no doubt, footage of a cargo plane with people clinging to the landing equipment of the cargo plane, and then the plane taking off with them still clinging on and then falling to their death. This is a horrific reality. And in a world like that, though this is easy for me to say from the safety of my office in the United States, when we look at something like that, we need to know that we have a God who is in control. Almost every manner of sexual sin is taught also in our culture today as a good thing. And there are individuals actively pushing to overthrow the family unit for the cause of feminism, an extreme notion of feminism. We need right now to know that we have a God who is in control. Our entire globe over the past couple of years has seen how quickly life and death can be on the line as this illness has swept across our land. And I'm so glad in the midst of that I know that I serve a God who is very much sovereign and is very much in control. But let me remind you that this does not mean that we will not face difficulty. I've had enough of Christians that give the impression that if you serve God faithfully, you'll always be made to be happy in terms of worldly benefits and goods and psychological happiness here on earth. That's not what the Bible promises us. God's job is not just to make people happy. I've spoken in hundreds and hundreds of churches over the past 20 years since I've been in the ministry. And most churches I've noticed a commonality. They have church nurseries. And in these church nurseries, they have decorations usually involving Noah's Ark. And Noah's Ark is always a happy picture there. Everybody's smiling. The sky is blue with big white clouds. And out on the front of the ark is always Papa Noah. And Papa Noah is looking out at the world like he's just so happy to be on that ark. He's ready to set the world on fire. And then you go, and he's got a big white fluffy beard, big rosy red cheeks. He just looks like Santa Claus and Robert Redford wrapped up into one beautiful man. And then back a little ways, you'll have Mama Noah. And Mama Noah is looking out at Papa Noah lovingly with longing and with Valentine's around her head, which has to be a little bit sexist. She's a woman, so she has to be thinking about romance all the time. I mean, after all, this is the most romantic place anyone would ever want to be, on an ark, shoveling manure off the side of an ark every day. This is what every woman wants. And then, of course, you've got all the animals smiling, rainbows shooting everywhere, and there's always a big old giraffe just looking around smiling at everyone. Looks like the Love Boat. Is that what Scripture gives us about Noah's Ark? Noah's Ark, frankly, was a miserable place. Every place that meant something to Noah and his family had now been wiped away by the judgment of God. The other people, whether or not they had a good relationship with Noah and his family, were now wiped away by the judgment of God. And I submit to you, the only joy that Noah had, and there is a difference here between joy and happiness, the fleeting happiness that we think of with our affections here on earth, with worldly goods and things that might make us quote unquote happy. But joy is something that's more permanent. And the only joy that Noah had was the joy of knowing that he was where God wanted him, doing what God wanted him to do. And the goal of a Christian ought to be, in part, that we get to that place where we can find joy in that, even if we aren't happy. With that in mind, God is not your butler or mine. He's not a genie in the bottle. And as a result of that, we may not always have happiness here on earth, but we can have joy, and we will one day spend eternity with him in heaven. Boy, that sounds like I'm wrapping up, but I'm just getting started. Let's take a look at Genesis chapter 48, and let's see how some of these themes come together in the last 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. 48 verse 1. Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is sick." So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. I want you to notice that Manasseh is mentioned first. Manasseh and Ephraim with him. When it was told to Jacob, "Behold, your son Joseph has come to you," Israel, that's Jacob. You should be picking up by now that Israel is Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. This is why Israel is Israel. But Jacob is Israel. Israel means something like one who wrestles with God or something like that. And Jacob wrestled with God. Okay. Behold, your son Joseph has come to you. Israel collected his strength and sat up in the bed. Okay, so he's in a bed. That's going to be important here in a moment. He sits up in the bed. 147 years old, got to sit up in the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz, that's Bethel, in the land of Canaan, and blessed me. And he said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a multitude of peoples, and will give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. Now your 2 sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine, Ephraim and Manasseh. All right, remember, I told you a moment ago, it was originally said Manasseh and Ephraim. Now it's saying Ephraim and Manasseh. You're about to find out why, so just don't worry about it. They shall be mine. In other words, I want to adopt my grandsons. I want to adopt your sons to be my sons. Now, of course, this wouldn't mean that Joseph isn't going to be considered their father anymore, right? And they're already Jacob's in the sense that they're Jacob's grandsons. But the fact is, Jacob is saying that even though Ephraim and Manasseh are already my grandsons, they will have full adoption as my sons. He actually does this. Why would he do this? Have you ever thought about this? Why would he do this? He's doing this so that he can give Joseph part of the birthright, right? More of the birthright. Now, the ultimate fulfillment of what we might call the spiritual side of the birthright would go through Judah, as who comes out of Judah? Well, Jesus comes out of Judah, right? The Messiah. But by the way, that coming through Judah, the Messiah coming through Judah, that sort of thing, that's how the seed of Abraham, through which all the nations would be blessed, happened, right? Through Jesus. But the worthwhile thing that Jacob could offer to Joseph and to his sons in general is the promised land of Canaan. He actually mentions that in verse 4. Did you see in verse 4 of the text we just read? It says, behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a multitude of people, and will give you this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. So you might be thinking, what can he give to his sons? They're in Egypt. They are living now in the lap of luxury. Jacob has a lot of stuff, but what really is going to be so meaningful? Well, the thing is, Jacob happens to know that this land has been promised, and he actually has a holding there. And so he has something meaningful to pass on to these sons. And so that's an important part of this. And of course, later the land was divided among the tribes that came out of these brothers. Now, have you at this point in the story ever wondered why we don't hear much about the tribe of Joseph? Well, we know about tribes for Jacob's sons, tribe of Judah, tribe of Ephraim, tribe of tribe of Reuben, tribe of Simeon, tribe of Levi. But why here do we have no tribe of Joseph? Well, I actually gave away a little bit the answer there because I said the tribe of Ephraim. The reason is because Joseph was split into 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, precisely because of what's happening in this text that we're reading right now. But that allowed Joseph to kind of get a double portion in perpetuity from his father. So this actually all works out to their benefit, all 3 of them, Ephraim, Manasseh, and of course, Joseph himself. Now, you do see the tribe of Joseph mentioned, for example, in Numbers chapter 13, verse 11, chapter 36, verse 5, and Revelation 7:8. But that seems to be referring to either one of the tribes. When it says tribe of Joseph there, it's either referring to Ephraim or Manasseh, or the household of Joseph, which includes both Ephraim and Manasseh. If you want the evidence that this actually did work out this way in terms of the tribes later on, Joshua 14:4 points out, for the sons of Joseph were 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. So basically, this is just Jacob finding a way to bless Joseph in a greater way by adopting his 2 sons. Verse 6 says, but your children that you have fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers in their inheritance. Now, as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey, and there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, and Ephrath is like near Bethlehem. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, who are these? And Joseph said to his father, they are my sons, whom God has given me here. Well, now, We're going to hear that Jacob's eyes are dim, but we already knew he wasn't confused about these sons. Really, what's going on here is this seems to be the opening lines like to a ceremony. We're getting into a ceremonial place where he's going to make all these pronouncements. And so this is probably, scholars think, a part of the ceremony. And we're not unfamiliar with this as 21st century Westerners. Whenever you go to a wedding, at some point, often, the person officiating the wedding will say, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" And the father may come and say, "I do," and that's been the traditional thing. But sometimes I've told the father, "Why don't you say, I and her mother do, the both of us." Or a mother might do it, or somebody else that's been meaningful in the life of this young woman. But if I'm officiating a wedding, as I have many weddings, and I ask who gives this woman to be married to this man, it's not because I didn't meet the dad already. I know the dad, I know the couple, I know everyone involved. It's just this is a part of the ceremony. And that's what's going on here, or likely is a ceremony of adoption sort of thing. And by the way, if you think this was just something made up by Bible authors, according to the IVP Bible Background Commentary of the Old Testament, the adoption practice, quote, "The adoption practice and formula here are very similar to those attested in the Code of Hammurabi. Additionally, one Ugaritic text features a grandfather adopting his grandson. In one sense, this adoption could be seen as the means by which Joseph is given the double portion of the inheritance due to the firstborn, since two of his sons received shares from Jacob's inheritance." So now you have a little bit more knowledge about what's going on there exactly. So are Ephraim and Manasseh, can they be said to be sons of Jacob? I mean, they're tribes. Can they be said to be sons of Jacob? Yeah, they can, actually. They can be said to be sons of Jacob because Jacob seems to have adopted them. They could still be sons of Jacob even if they were the grandsons, because the Bible does talk that way too. But he said, continuing verse 9, so he said, "Bring them to me, please, so that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see, and Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your children as well." The blessings that Jacob is experiencing here. Then Joseph took them both, Ephraim, then Joseph took them from his knee and bowed with his face to the ground. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right, and brought them close to him. And I was trying to think through this. If you want to have a picture, it said a while ago that Jacob sat up in bed. So Jacob's in bed. Joseph's placement isn't really all that important for what we're doing right now. But Ephraim and Manasseh are like standing on either side of the bed, right? And it tells you which hand, which gives you which side of the bed they're on. And Joseph has positioned the boys such that Manasseh is toward Jacob's right hand, which would be the preferential position for a firstborn. Now we're getting to this issue about why was Manasseh listed first and then Ephraim listed first later on. Well, it's because of what's about to happen right now. But Israel reached out his right hand and placed it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his hand. So anyway, Jacob is going like this. He's supposed to do it this way, bless them this way. He's going like this. He's got his arms crossed. He's crossing his hands. Although Manasseh was the firstborn, so even though Manasseh is the firstborn, he's giving the right hand blessing to Ephraim and left hand on Manasseh's head. And he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys. And may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." When Joseph saw that his father placed the right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him. And he grasped his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. So here's Jacob, and Joseph's like, it would have been uncool to bring this up in the midst of this blessing taking place, but Joseph is like, I can't let this blessing go awry. I've got to get involved. He's not blessing the right kid. He's giving like the firstborn blessing to the wrong kid. And Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also will become a people, and he also will be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day. And we're going to read the blessing in a moment. Well, we'll go ahead and read. Saying, "By you, Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." And so he put Ephraim before Manasseh. In other words, he's saying people will mention Ephraim before Manasseh. Now, here's the question. Obviously, Jacob spoke with God. He heard from God. He knows about the promise that is coming through his family line. He knows about all of that. So there's a couple of ways of thinking about why he did this, right? Why did he reverse the blessing in terms of the boys' ages? Some have said, well, maybe this is this has been a family thing, right? This did happen with Abraham and Isaac, and now it's happening with Jacob. Abraham had Ishmael, and then it was Isaac that was actually the child that was going to carry forth the promise and also be the child of blessing and all that. And then with Isaac, you had Jacob and Esau, and it fell to Jacob. And now Jacob is doing this. Some people might think, well, he's just like, well, dadgummit, if it happened to me, it's going to happen to somebody else. That's not very satisfying, is it? And it doesn't seem to match the wisdom we get from Jacob at this point in his life. Instead, what is likely an explanation for this is that Jacob just has, in some way, it's been revealed to him what God's intentions are here. And this is what he knows God wants him to do. It may be that he could almost not resist to do this thing. And so this is all, I think, illuminating. Verse 21 says, "Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. And I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow." Okay, now, this isn't as clear as we'd like it to be, but it's sometimes considered to be a reference to what happened with the siege of Shechem. You remember the story of Shechem from a few chapters back? Well, that was Simeon and Levi that basically carried all that out. And perhaps Jacob is metaphorically referring to Simeon and Levi as my sword and my bow. Like he's referring to them as instruments of warfare. If that's what's going on here, that land apparently became his property. In fact, the story of Jesus and the woman at the well takes place near Shechem. Let's go ahead and look real quick, just take a side quest over here to John 4 through 14, and let's just see what is said there. We're fast forwarding to the New Testament, right? And this is Jesus. And I love bringing Jesus into any passage of the Bible, right? Because ultimately it's all about him. It says in John 4:4, it says, "And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, 'Give me a drink.' For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, 'How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?' For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Before we go on, let's just point out a couple of things here in this text. And that is, and by the way, this is from John, and I have someone requested that the next book I cover be the Gospel of John, and it's funny, that could be confirmation. I've actually been considering that. But so fast forward into the future, the land gets divided up among the tribes of Israel. But when we get to the period of the kings, and we have David, and then we have Solomon, and then after Solomon, the kingdom is divided between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And so in the south, there is Judah and Benjamin, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, but people just kind of refer to that as Judah in the south. All right, and this is the group of people that have stayed faithful to the Davidic family, kingship idea. And then you have in the north what is sometimes just referred to as Israel, but it's actually 10 other tribes, primarily or a big chunk of that being Ephraim. So when the northern kingdom was taken by the Assyrians, these Ephraimites were intermarried with multiple peoples. Well, that region was now populated by people that were genetically mixed between Jews and other peoples of all kinds of peoples. And so the Jews looked down on them because they were like half breeds. That is a horrible, horrible, offensive term, but it's how they were thought of. And so Jesus is here now interacting with this woman, and she's basically saying, why are you, don't you know I'm a Samaritan? Don't you know what you think of me? And it even says to us in the text in verse 9, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. She said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle? Jesus answered and said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. Jesus is, I don't know another way to say it. Jesus is so cool. He's just so cool. His interactions like this. So, so we have here reference to this land that is near Shechem, and Shechem would whether it was just the land that was bought there by Jacob or that he took during this thing, and if that's what he's referring to, it would make sense out of this, and it would make sense out of Jacob's well being where it is near Shechem like that. So there's hopefully some stuff to help you. Onward and upward to chapter 49, verse 1. Then Jacob summoned his sons and said, assemble yourselves so that I may tell you what will happen to you in the days to come. Gather together and listen, sons of Jacob. Yes, listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. All right, Reuben's tough. Now, the one thing to say is, we don't have the information that we like about all the things that are listed here as blessings or curses. And I also want to say that sometimes you may encounter people who think they know more what some of this stuff means than they can possibly know. And I'll show you what I mean as we move along through this. So some of this, there can't really be much of a comment about without speculation. So we might speculate a little bit, but we just don't have all the information we'd like. Verse 4, uncontrollable as water, you shall not have preeminence because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Now, notice what's going on here. He's in the middle of this very ceremonial pronouncement here. And Reuben, you remember Reuben slept with Bilhah, and Jacob knew about it. That was one of the handmaidens that Jacob had. And he stops after he points this out. Uncontrollable as water, you shall not have preeminence because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. And then it's like he stops and looks at everybody else. He went up to my couch. Can you believe it? This is basically what's being said. Hilarious. Maybe not to him or to anyone involved, really. You might not have. Now, here's something I want you to think about, and Steve Gregg pointed this out, and I thought it was really good, is that, look, when you get away with something, or you think you've gotten away with something, nobody catches you in a particular thing, or you're not punished for a particular thing, or whatever. You may feel like you got away with it. And he rolls out this Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. It kind of reminds you of this, because it says in that passage, quote, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil. Although a sinner does evil 100 times and may lengthen his life, still I know that it will be well for those who fear God, who fear him openly. So what this passage is saying is, look, let's read the first part again. Because the sentence against evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil. So you don't get in trouble, or there's not punishment for what you did, and it seems like you got away with it. So you do it again, you do it again, you do it again. And before very long, it doesn't even bother you anymore. You're not even feeling things that years ago. Think about the sins in your own life or the sins that you deal with. Years ago, that particular sin horrified you that you committed it. But yet, here you are now. Most of the time, it doesn't even bother you. Now, you can try to make yourself feel a little bit better by pointing out that, well, no, it kind of bothers me. And since it kind of bothers me, I'm all right, Hey, it does bother me. But does it really bother you? If it really bothered you, is it bothering you enough that you bend the knee to the king and get that thing out of your life? The problem is when we go without getting punished for our sins long enough, then ultimately we tend to think we're going to get away with it. Well, what this story actually illustrates for us is that Reuben didn't get away with it. He probably thought that he did, but here at the very final moments of his father's life, it comes back to haunt him. And so I think that's an important thing to bring out here. Verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are implements of violence. Now, obviously, they're brothers, but there's more going on with that. It's like they're brothers in another sense. It's like they're brothers in violence is kind of what it's like. It'd be like if you had someone that had like 4 or 5 boys, or 4 or 5 kids in general, and 2 boys were always just getting into trouble together. You'd be like, they sure are brothers, right? Something like that. Verse 6, may my soul not enter into their counsel. May my glory not be united with their assembly. For in their anger they killed men, and in their self-will they lamed oxen. Now, this is really mean-spirited. To lame an ox would typically be, in this culture, to hamstring something. If you hamstring an animal, you've cut its hamstring, like with a sword or something. Often this was done to horses so that people couldn't use them in combat or whatever. But it wouldn't even make sense, really, to do it to an ox. So this is almost like saying you senselessly did these things. You senselessly killed men, and you senselessly damaged livestock like this. No blessing, all right? Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them among Israel. As for you, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you. And there's a little bit of a, what am I trying to say? Like a terminological thing happening here, because Judah is like a turn of phrase, because Judah actually refers to praise. It says your brothers shall praise you. Okay. But this is similar to the blessing Jacob received. And then in verse 9, Judah is a lion's cub. Now this is getting super interesting here. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He crouches. He lies down as a lion. And as a lion, who dares to stir him up? Now, obviously, it's hard to know exactly what some of these animal things mean. But it's not hard to see here that lions are seen as unbeatable, right? The king of, the top of the animal kingdom food chain kind of thing. King of the jungle, I guess that's what I was looking for. Regal, powerful, without predators. Now, obviously, this isn't true. There are things that kill lions, but I'm just saying the image there is what we're trying to picture. And of course, Jesus, he's saying this to Judah, and of course, Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So that's fun. It goes back to this. This is what it all goes back to. Verse 10: the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. Until Shiloh comes. What does that mean? And to him shall be the obedience of the obedience of the peoples. Now, what does this mean? So it's saying that the scepter is not going to go away from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. Now, it didn't even end up going away after Shiloh comes, because this is likely a messianic prophecy. The Messiah came out of Judah. Shiloh means him to whom it rightly belongs, or something like that. The one to whom it rightly belongs. And it's saying here that this is not going to leave until the Shiloh comes. Well, this sure has the earmarks of messianic prophecy. And you can see why. Shiloh might be a reference, and was taken by many to be a reference to a messianic figure. And so this may be a reference to Jesus, and it's coming, and this is given to Judah. So it all works. This all seems to make sense. I think this is a messianic prophecy. And of course, his scepter represents rule, right? Verse 11, he ties his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are dull from wine and his teeth white from milk. Now, you're looking at this and you might be thinking, well, first of all, some of this, like that donkey business, doesn't even make any sense. And second, what? This does not sound good. His eyes are dull from wine. This guy's a drunkard. No, that's not really the point. The point is that Judah, the people that are going to come out of Judah are going to be very prosperous, probably. I mean, wine, milk, the grapes, these that you make wine out of, these are all things that are marks of prosperity. His donkey's colt to the choice vine. He ties his, So the thing about this is a grapevine is not actually that strong. We just came back from California and we saw all these, all this wine country, all these vineyards. And, typically they're not that strong. You wouldn't want to tie an animal up to it because they might pull the whole thing down, pull away. But if you've got a really strong, if you've been so blessed and have such a strong crop that the vines are thick and thick enough that you could tie an animal to it and it couldn't run off, well, then you're definitely experiencing prosperity. White from milk, you've got so much milk that it's making your teeth white. Your eyes are dull from wine. You've got all this wine. What's this thing about washing your garments in wine? Well, it's just that wine is so disposable because we have so much of it that you could wash your clothes in it. It's like that's how prosperous you'll be. All right, Judah comes out pretty good here. But then verse 13, Zebulun will reside at the seashore, and he shall be a harbor for ships, and his flank shall be towards Sidon. Now, this would be best understood not to be referring to the Mediterranean Sea, but rather to the Sea of Galilee. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 1, it says these words, "But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times, he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But later on, he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea, on the other side of Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles." And then he goes on to say this, and I'm reading this because it's going to be referenced by Matthew's gospel in Matthew chapter 4. So we see here Zebulun, Galilee, and verse 2 says, "The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them." And if you go over to Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 16, he quotes this and he applies it to Jesus. And so this is helpful for a number of reasons, but one thing is to point out the location of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali by the way of the sea. But it specifies beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. So these are things that I think will be helpful in understanding what's going on here with this passage. I always think it's great to cross-reference and see if something is discussed elsewhere in the Bible, and then especially if it has some fulfillment in Jesus, and Matthew often draws that out for us. Verse 14, Issachar is a strong donkey lying down between the sheepfolds. When he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, he bowed his shoulder to carry burdens and became a slave at forced labor. Now, something like this would have happened during the invasion, the Assyrian invasion. This could be referencing that or not. It's just not as clear as we would like. Now, look at verse 16. This is interesting, and this might be where I'm talking about people trying to say more about this than I think they can without admitting speculation, right? Verse 16, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Now, Dan means basically God's judge or a judge of God or something like that. Not judging God, but a person who is judging on behalf of God, perhaps. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned viper in the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider falls backward. And then Jacob has this aside again, kind of like he had an aside a moment ago, and he's like, "Can you believe he came up to my couch? Slept with poor Bilhah." His aside here is, "For your salvation I wait, Lord." So let's read it again. Notice how bad it is. Verse 17. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned viper in the path that bites the horse's heel, so that this rider falls backwards. For your salvation I wait, Lord. Now, some have said that some have argued, some pre-trib, premillennial futurists as it comes to eschatology and end times, have argued that the Antichrist is going to come out of the tribe of Dan, partly because of this verse. This is not the only verse they try to use. Nowhere in the Bible is the Antichrist specifically. We're never given a detail like that about the Antichrist. But still, that being said, that they look at this and they say, okay, here you've got this horrible, horrible character being described as a serpent, no less. And then Jacob says, for your salvation I wait, Lord. Well, this must be referring to the Antichrist. Now, that, if you don't consider that to be a stretch, I'm not sure the word has any meaning. But another thing that they'll use here to argue for this is that in Revelation chapter 7, when it's going through all the tribes, Dan is not mentioned. And they think that could be part of the reason for that too. Something for you to go study on your own. I don't recommend that as a genuine, plausible explanation. Verse 19, as for Gad, a band of raiders shall attack him, but he will attack at their heels. As for Asher, his food shall be rich, and he will yield royal delicacies. Naphtali is a doe let loose. He utters beautiful words. Now, we don't know anything about Naphtali, but that he's in the family. Apparently, he was a really good speaker, or his people would be very good speakers, something like that. Verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful branch by a spring. Its branches hang over a wall. The archers provoked him and shot at him and were hostile toward him. But his bow remained firm, and his arms were agile. From the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. So now, Joseph is a fruitful branch by a spring, its branches hanging over a wall. Now that branch is a fruitful tree with its branches hanging over the wall. Now, I don't interpret things like Joseph was able to interpret dreams, but it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to think that what Jacob is thinking of here is how Joseph was he was a fruitful man, right? And everything he did became successful. But his branches hung over the wall. It's like they blessed other people's. You could think about that being Joseph was planted in Egypt, and and over the wall is his family, and he's blessing them. Or perhaps you could think of it as over the wall blessing Egypt. But that seems to make sense. And of course, the archers provoking him, shot at him, were hostile toward him. This seems to be Jacob poetically talking about the difficulties that Joseph faced in his time, although that might not be it. It might be that there's some future point where something happened that seems more closely to fit with this. So, just throwing it out there. Verse 24, but his bow remained firm, okay, and his arms were agile from the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. So that sounds like God. Okay, the mighty one of Jacob is God. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Now that's weird. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Now, you can call God a shepherd, like God the Father in a sense, but Jesus is also a shepherd. And we have here precious cornerstone. And from there is the shepherd. I think it's possible we have something messianic going on in that text as well. Verse 25, from the God of our Father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father have surpassed the blessings of my ancestors. Up to the furthest boundary of the everlasting hills, may they be on the head of Joseph, and on the top of the head of the one distinguished among his brothers. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the spoils. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them. He blessed them, every one with the blessing appropriate to him. Right? Yeah. All right, we're almost done here. Hang with me. Jacob dies. Verse 29, then he commanded them and said to them, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the fields of Ephron, the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is opposite Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field from Ephron the Hittite as a burial site. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it, purchased from the sons of Heth. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. All right, chapter 50, verse 1. I think all that was fairly self-explanatory. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Okay, now, I'm going to read to you something from, again, from the IVP Bible Background Commentary of the Old Testament about the practice of embalming, because I think this is pretty helpful in understanding this and maybe drawing out an application for us. I'll tell you what I mean in a moment. Although it was the usual practice in Egypt for everyone who could afford it, embalming of Israelites is found only in this passage. This was an elaborate and ritual-filled procedure performed by a trained group of mortuary priests. It involved removing the internal organs and placing of the body in embalming fluids for 40 days. The idea behind this is based on the Egyptian belief that the body had to be preserved as a repository for the soul after death. The bodies of Jacob and Joseph are embalmed. And while this may have been done to soothe the feelings of the Egyptians, it also served the purpose of preserving their bodies for later burial in Canaan. So, yeah, I mean, think about it even now. If we don't embalm someone, unfortunately, decomposition begins to happen pretty quickly. And so Joseph knows that this is going to be a drawn-out funerary procedure, and it's going to take days and days. And so as a result, yeah, let's just go ahead and embalm, do the embalming. Yeah, so that keeps it going. But then there's another question about this that we might want to consider, and that is, okay, yeah, but hold on. They take these organs out, and they put them in this embalming fluid and all these kind of things. They basically disassemble the person. And how should we view this as individuals who believe in a resurrection one day, and that we will have physical bodies, will be physically resurrected? Should we or should we not be embalmed? And should we be cremated? Is that permissible? My father has a book that he wrote, I guess about 40 years ago now, called Pastor, I Have a Question. And it just has like the 100 most asked Bible questions he'd received. He had a radio show. And he, one of them was, they all have these big long answers. One of them was, is it wrong for Christians to be cremated? And he just said no. That's it, just no. And I think, that's interesting. Is that right? Well, here we see an embalming practice. In fact, one that was foreign to how the Israelites, Jacob's family, I guess, at this point, functioned when it comes to somebody dying. And even some ceremonial stuff that Jacob's family would not be on board with. We don't know that sort of stuff related to pagan gods would have been involved in. We would suspect it wouldn't be, but we don't know for sure. But one thing that I do think is when you talk about this basically disassembling a person and doing all these things, when I hear people that are very upset by the notion of cremation, I understand wanting to be cautious about everything that we do in our lives to please God. But understand that every 10 years or so, it's my understanding that most of the cells in the human body cycle out and are replaced. So that as you look at your hand right now, you look at your hand and you may even see a scar on your hand. I've got scars and a small bit of vitiligo on my hands. And I look at that hand and I even see history on that hand. I see the scar. I remember the story about that scar. That scar was from, 25 years ago, something like that. So the question is that the same hand? Well, no, apparently not. It seems that the cells are cycled out and are replaced such that your hand is not even the same hand you once had. So if the concern is that that we have to have this exact arrangement of particles at the resurrection, or else it won't work or something. Well, that's silly, right? Because you don't even have the same exact collection of particles from one decade to the next. And beyond all of that, when it comes to cremation or anything else, here we see an example in the Bible of someone having organs taken out and all these kind of things. This is not going to bother God at the resurrection. Trust me, the God that can create universes from nothing and set up the system that would cycle your cells out will have no trouble handling that problem in your own life and giving you a resurrection body. So things to keep in mind as we go through this, things that you might not have expected we would cover in this passage. All right, now 40 days were required, verse 3. 40 days were required for such is the period required for embalming, and the Egyptians wept for 70 days. When the days of mourning for him were past, Joseph spoke to the house of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your sight, please speak to Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I am about to die. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now then, please let me go and bury my father, then I will return." And Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the household of Joseph, and his brothers, and his father's household. And they left only their little ones and their flocks and their herds in the land of Goshen. Chariots with teams of horses also went up with him, and it was a very great company. This is a big entourage. This is a big deal happening here. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they mourned there with a very great and sorrowful lamentation. And he observed 70 days of mourning for his father. 7 days of mourning for his father. I was getting confused because we did learn a moment ago that the Egyptians wept for 70 days. But he observed 7 days of mourning for his father. Now, when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians." Therefore, it was named Abel Mizraim, the mourning of the Egyptians, which is beyond the Jordan. All right, we're almost. This is it. We're getting here to the end here. The burial at Machpelah. And so his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah opposite Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field as a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. And after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Now, I want to read to you something from the New Bible Commentary, 21st edition of Genesis, 21st century edition by D.A. Carson et al. It says, "The extended description of Jacob's death and burial looks like morbid melodrama. It is, in fact, a celebration of the fulfillment of the promises at Bethel or Luz. God had promised Jacob that he would make him fruitful and give him the land. Now Jacob reflected on how far these promises had come true. He had never expected to see Joseph again, but he had seen his grandsons as well. He also owned land in Canaan, a burial ground at Mamre, and a ridge of land captured from the Amorites." So now you shouldn't view this as like, it's like my dad always says, I don't want anybody saying, because you'll hear Christians say all the time, my funeral should be a celebration of life. I want you to praise God and be happy and laugh and all those kind of things. Hey, that's fine. If that's what, principally, I'm not sure that should be your business. If you've got loved ones who are in mourning for you and they're sad that you're not with them, let them have their mourning. They can still celebrate that they're going to see you again. As I've said many times, the Christians mourn when someone dies who's a believer, not because we're never going to see them again, but because we won't see them for a long time. If I go away on a trip and leave my wife and kids at home for a week, I'm sad. I'm not sad because I think I'm never going to see them again. I'm sad because I won't see them for a week. If my father died today, I'd be sad. Not sad because I'd never see him again. I have the promise I will. But sad because I won't see him again for potentially decades. And so it's okay to mourn. My dad always, in fact, said, I don't want any of that being happy at my funeral. I want there to be not a dry eye in the place. I want everybody to say, how are we ever going to make it without him? How are we going to survive? That's funny. I hope he doesn't actually mean that, but it is perfectly legitimate to have mourning. But in this case, what we should see is this is very much, though there was mourning, I'm sure in the traditional sense involved, this is a celebratory thing. Jacob could have never anticipated the entourage that would be there for his funeral. Now that Joseph is gone, the next thing that we're about to see is that the boys get, the other brothers besides Joseph, get concerned about what Joseph might do to them. Verse 15 says, when Joseph's brothers had seen that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him? So they sent instructions to Joseph saying, your father commanded us before he died, saying, this is what you shall say to Joseph. Please forgive, I beg you, the offense of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now please forgive the offense of the servant of the God of your father, servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to keep many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. This is obviously a great example of forgiveness, but this is also a famous text. At the top of this episode, I mentioned Calvinism and how Calvinists are determinists that believe that you're making choices. You're making the choices you want to make, but the reason you want to make those particular choices is a part of a deterministic system, such that ultimately you're doing what you choose, but what you choose is determined by God. So you feel like some would reject this, but I think on Calvinism, they're saying something like, or it shakes out to something like, you feel as though you're making real choices. You feel as though you are making libertarian choices that you could have done otherwise, because you are doing whatever you want. But your wants, your actions flow from your wants, and your wants are a part of a causal chain that goes back to God himself, at least a causal explanatory chain back to God himself, such that it couldn't have been otherwise. God determines all things. When one of their favorite passages is Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, because as we talk about what Joseph's brothers did to sell him into slavery, and now all the good that's been brought out of that, Joseph says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to keep many people alive. So in other words, it looks like there's an equivalence between what God meant and what these wicked brothers meant. And it seems like that they had an intention about this and God had an intention about this. And so it looks like determinism is true. God determined that these brothers would do this thing so that God could do something else. This will not work, at least not if we mean determinism in the philosophical sense. What's actually, I think, I'll say it the way that, by the way, I should say, there's a great debate on this between two Trinity professors on Unbelievable Christian Radio, Premier Christian Radio, Unbelievable, with Justin Brierley, between Leighton Flowers and Chris Date. And they debate this very text right in the middle of the program. And it's very interesting. And I'm not a languages expert anywhere near to the extent that Chris Date is. So that made it an interesting discussion to hear what he had to say about this. But I actually think that I like the way that Johnathan Pritchett put it. He says, what it says is, what you intended for evil, I intended for good, basically. But he didn't say, I intended for you to intend it for evil so that then I could intend what you intended for evil to intend for good. It doesn't say all that. It's just, we have a God who is looking at individuals who he knows, because he's omniscient, are going to do this wicked thing. And he can then mean that, intend that, and plan that such that what they're freely doing on their own, He can redeem it and bring something great out of it. Think about it. If God can do something this big with wicked, disobedient men, just think of what he could do with obedient men. And I think that's a better way of thinking about this. The reality is God redeems our sinful choices all the time and turns them into something beautiful. Any Christian who is a fan of adoption, my brother was adopted, and many people who are adopted, the way that they were conceived was wicked. Could have been some sexual assault, could be something that was just sexually immoral, could be all kinds of things that I don't think God wants. But God can redeem that situation and make something beautiful out of that child's life. And I submit to you that I think this is exactly what's going on with this text. God knew what they were going to do, so he intended it for good. They planned this themselves as well, and they intended it for evil. But I don't think God determined anything for them in the philosophical sense. So as we talk about sovereignty and control, there's a good example of how a Calvinist sees that sovereignty being worked out in terms of how God exercises his power in the position of sovereignty, and how non-Calvinists do. All right, Steve, another thing I want to say about this real quick is, by way of illustration, is one of our Trinity professors, Steve Gregg, his first wife, I think it was his first wife, died in a car accident only a few months after they were married. And when he talks about this, he says, it is true that we can mourn and that mourning has its place. But he balances out what I said earlier, because he says, when that happened to my wife, I didn't grieve like I see other people grieving. And obviously it wasn't that I didn't want my wife back, but I just didn't have that experience. And I didn't go through these stages that everyone thinks you have to go through. And he said, I just never really was, it wasn't that difficult for me to understand, intellectually at least, what has happened and move on from that. And he says, I never was mad at God. I just kind of understood, those sorts of things. And he chalks that up to being a Christian and knowing that one day he's going to see her again. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but I have experienced grief and went through all those levels, and I'm a Christian. Are you saying that I'm in sin? No, I'm not saying that. I think that I have and I will go through that sort of thing as well. It's just that as a Christian, you have extra help in this department. You have extra help when it comes to this, because the Bible tells us in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13, we don't want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, which is a first century euphemism for dead. We don't want you to be ignorant about those people that are dead, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. In other words, you don't need to grieve. He doesn't say, I don't know that he means you shouldn't grieve at all. He may mean you don't have to, but what he's certainly indicating is, don't grieve like they're grieving. They have no hope. You have hope. And that is a great benefit to those of us who are believers. All right, let's finish this. Verse 22. Now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household. And Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons. Also, the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knee. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will assuredly take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will assuredly take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and they embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. He wants them to promise at his death that when they eventually leave Egypt, because they must eventually leave Egypt, because they have to go to the promised land. This is what it's all about. This is what this family is all about. And so he says, when you eventually leave, take my bones with you. And hundreds of years later, that's exactly what happened. God's in control. He was in control from the very beginning with the creation of the world. He was in control throughout the events that took place with the Tower of Babel, the flood, all those kind of things. He was in control through Abraham's life and right on up to what we see here. And we can look forward in a way that these Israelites living this story out could not do. We can look forward to the day when Shiloh did come and that we know him, and his name is Jesus. Powerful, powerful. As I close out this years-long study through the book of Genesis, I want to say that Genesis is, to me, unlike any other Bible book in that it has so many features that are so disparate. I mean, we have various types of genre. We have narrative. We have historical material. We've got perhaps some imagery and things like that. So many interesting theological issues. I wouldn't have thought this would be the truth, but I think now that we've gotten to the end of this, if one listens to the entirety of this Genesis series, I don't think, there certainly aren't very many, there may not be any major issues that come up in, say, a systematic theology textbook that weren't in some way touched on in this series, because Genesis gives us fertile ground to discuss so many things about the nature of God and the faith. So many great principles about God learned for our own lives as we see application, and a reminder that from the beginning, God has been in control. As Genesis comes to a close, I plan to move on to a new book of the Bible. But as always, I hope this one has been a blessing to you.